Kia ora, listeners of One of 200 podcast. Today, in One of 200's campaign series, we have a special episode, and we are going to discuss a recent controversy surrounding the Foreign Minister of New Zealand, one of the most powerful political players in New Zealand, taking aim at protesters about their kind of protest that they conducted. Now, these attacks are not new. Winston Peters has a history of targeting individuals. These are just common citizens who are exercising their right to protest, which is enshrined in the Bill of Rights as part of our freedom of expression. And in the past, for example, I remember a young student from University of Canterbury being targeted because he protested against Winston Peters. And Winston Peters, this is a young student in his, probably late teens or very early 20s. And Winston Peters took shot at him, calling him ginger nut because, he had red hair. And so this is a pattern we're seeing where what Winston Peters uses time and again is a strategy which is called the dead cat strategy. This is a strategy that is talked about a lot in UK politics. People like Boris Johnson have used this a lot. It is something that political analysts say is when there are major crises as a result of a failure of the government policies, then we have actors like Boris Johnson, like Winston Peters, like Donald Trump, who would just bring in a non-issue and put it on the top of the table in order to distract attention away from the failure of the government that he represents and the policies that he has put forward. And so there are many ways of doing this. And this particular attack on protesters, I would argue, is a good example of the dead cat strategy. Now, just thinking about the history of Winston Peters a little bit. Winston Peters started his career about 50 years ago, 1978. He won election, and so he's been about in the field for about 50 years now, just less than 50 years. And incidentally, this coincides a rise in New Zealand's inequality, decline in workers' rights, even though Winston Peters has put himself, he plays the character of anti-establishment. You can see that regardless of which combination that he comes into power with, the status quo continues and workers' rights are being eroded. Our welfare system is being eroded. Public services are being eroded. And we can also see that we have become even more so a lapdog of the US empire under Winston Peters. So he talks the big game, but ultimately he, in my view, is not a courageous person. He is a coward, and he has certain emotional kind of attachments, for example, to the British Empire and the US Empire, which actually weakens his position as an effective foreign minister. He's, for example, failed in seeing that the future isn't with the US empire, that the US empire is in decline, and that the future lies elsewhere in the global south. He's still holding on to the US empire, the genocidal US empire, so he's ineffective as a foreign minister. And it seems like his career has been marked more by ambition and careerism rather than actual policy change at the ground. So to talk about Winston Peters and his recent controversial statements about people's right to protest in this country, I have with me two special guests. I have Anu and I have Joe Carolan, and I will pass it on to both of them to introduce themselves and to talk a little bit about the protest that they carried out on the streets of Auckland. Anu.
Kia ora, Anu here from Migrant Workers Association. As an organization who stands alongside workers' rights, we have a long history of protesting and also raising issues in many other ways, petitions, submissions, direct action in the form of protests. Yeah, uh, this time, yeah, the this protest that took place about 10 days ago was organized by Migrant Workers Association, whereby the racism in this country has been on the rise for a number of years, and the final, I guess you could say, the tipping point was when just days before our protest, Winston Peters had been openly racist to one of his colleagues, a Green Party MP, Lawrence Xu-nan, who is a Chinese Kiwi, came here at a very, very young age, been here for 3 decades or just more. And uh, basically, instead of answering the question that Lawrence put forward, Winston decided to take to racist attack. So that you could say was the tipping point, not the just a one standalone incident that led to our protest. Um, so yeah, that's the reason behind it, and yeah,
Yeah.
it was a satire, political theater,
Hmm.
where we had a mock guillotine and an effigy of Winston Peters. And from the very outset, it was made clear that this is satire, and no one is about to be hurt during this event. And that's exactly how the protest took shape. But as you've already said in your introduction, that Mr. Winston Peters himself didn't like it very much because I think it's not so much about our protest or the way we protest. It's just about him being challenged in a very big way, and that challenge is now, I think, going very far and wide within Aotearoa and internationally as well, because
Hmm.
the news has been covered with international media outlets. So I think that's more the problem, that someone who doesn't like being challenged and doesn't like apologizing for his mistakes is being held
Hmm.
to account.
Yeah, that seems like a theme, isn't it? He doesn't like to be held to
Yeah.
account. He doesn't like to be questioned. He has very, cliche phrases that he uses, like "hello, sunshine," or, ways to
Hmm.
patronize the person who asks the
Yeah.
question. But
Yeah.
what we are
Yeah.
really seeing from New Zealand first, yeah,
Yeah.
go on.
Yeah, I was just going to another one of their favorites, Sim and Shane Jones's show gratitude. I mean, who says that these days, and
Yeah.
that to their colleagues?
Yeah. And so, what
Yeah.
we are seeing from New Zealand first is kind of like this imported politics, perhaps like a copycat from the United States, something that worked for Trump. They're trying to use that in order to what we would say, or how I would see it, is as a strategy to divide the working class and to divert attention away from the failure of the, economic system and the policies that he has overseen in his role as deputy prime minister and currently as finance minister, sorry, foreign minister. But what we are, seeing when he says, go back to where you came from and all that rhetoric about democracy, it's very ironic, isn't it, that he talks the big game about democracy, but then just the next day or so, he is trying to limit our democratic rights by attacking protesters who, raised the issue with his performance in Parliament. So we also have with us Joe Carolan. And Joe, hello.
Hiya, Josephine. How's it going?
Going okay? How are you?
Greetings from Australia. Yeah, I'm just over here on a bit of a recce. I've met some people here, and look, it's quite worrying. As you said, the rise in racist politics in many Western democracies now, following what's happened in the core of the empire in the United States with Trump, with ICE, with the war on Iran, with the genocide in Gaza, Western politicians now going beyond their normal limits of bourgeois respectability and actually insulting, jailing, invading, and breaking international law openly, right? And we see this war come home, if you like, when we see these attacks on migrants, many of whom have grown up in New Zealand, told to go home, sunshine, patronising, right? We decided to draw a red line under this rubbish. Winston gets away with it every single election, and he uses the media cynically, and he uses outrage politics cynically to build up a voting base for himself, to get his lazy ass back into Parliament, and then act as a kingmaker with either National or Labour. Now, sometimes in politics, you have to have a sharp edge and you have to draw a red line through some heads, if you like. And that's what street theatre is about. That the normal goings and comings of parliamentary politics and its outrage suddenly are challenged on the street by the mob. And James Connolly, the Irish revolutionary, said, all hail to the mob, the protectors of democracy. It was the mob, the mobilization, that brought democracy to the streets of Paris with the guillotine when it chopped off the heads of kings and queens. And indeed, in the mother of all parliaments in Westminster, if you ever enter the palace there, you will see the hall where King Charles I was executed by Parliament, establishing that there is no divine rule of kings, but there is the democracy that derives from the people. Indeed, only last month, the American state celebrated 250 years since its revolution, where it overthrew the rule of the feudal order by force of arms. And the excellent article by Alistair McClymont, one of the foremost immigration lawyers in New Zealand, where he went, in America, at the birth of its parliamentary democracy, which interestingly, tolerated slavery for another 100 years, in case anyone has illusions about Western democracy. But at that time, McClymont says that the guillotine was used as a symbol of democracy in that fledgling republic, as a kind of theatrical draw point for discussion and debate in many cities, So we decided to use this because this guy needs the chop. He needs to go. He needs to be sacked. Whatever metaphor you want to use in the English language. And Winston is quite good at lecturing people about the English language. So I am here as one of the people who was colonized first by the English. We Irish have learned how to speak the English language better than most. And I would say that, for example, with the spill that's happening in the National Party tonight, that many people are using the metaphor, heads will roll, Luxon's going to get the chop, because that is the metaphors that are used in the English language when we talk about needing to give someone the sack, right?
Right.
If we'd just been all normal and polite and left this to the parliamentary elite, Winston would have got away with this, right? He's not getting away with this because what has happened in the last few days is not only has National ruled this guy out a little bit, and very weakly, which has now caused the crisis of Luxon's leadership, actually. He should have shown that he was strong and sacked Winston instantly. That's what would have happened to any racist old bugger in a workplace. Or if a child had haunted someone racially in a school, but he didn't. Now he's paying the price. Maybe his own head will roll. Maybe Luxon's for the chop tomorrow. Who knows? But what has happened is now the Labour Party and Chris Hipkins, another pathetic weakling who needs to get stronger, suddenly has found the courage to rule out any coalition with New Zealand first. Not not the simple thing that Winston shouldn't be a minister or whatever, but we are actually putting a cordon sanitaire around this racist party, which should have been done 20 years ago, right? All the racists out there, go and vote for Winston Peters all you like, but you have no coalition partners to go to anymore. The National Party will not touch it because you're racists, and the Labour Party will not touch it because you're racist. So waste your votes all you like, you losers. You will never get into power again. And that is the power of street theatre. That is the power of the mob mobilising on the street. That is the power of a little bit of courage, determination, and anti-racist principles in this country, that we can put this old, drunk, racist uncle to bed at last.
Thank you so much for that, Joe. But I was just thinking about this, right? It's bizarre. Like, I've seen and I've been part of many protests in my, lifetime, burning effigies, standing on pictures, throwing, metaphorical stones at the pictures or the forms or the mannequins. We've had, street theater in protests recently, for example, where we had like the head of Luxon being or put on trial for complicity with genocide. So it is a democratic right, and to be attacking it while in the same breath talking about the superior system of
Sure.
New Zealand over, for example, China, that's what he was getting at. He was talking about
Yeah.
China not having that. But in the same breath, in the same, stretch, in that same kind of moment, attacking you both and the protesters who staged this satirical performance as part of your protest. It's just really bizarre. It's really
I
bizarre
mean,
because,
and it also goes to show the double standards and hypocrisy
Yeah.
of the racist right? These bullies are well used to dishing it out and punching down on the weak. Winston Peters called intellectually disabled people the R word, right? The retard, right? That is a brutal word that hurts so many people and their feelings, right?
yeah.
He's punched down on Indian people. He's punched down on Chinese people, right?
Oh,
And when
absolutely.
people complain about
Muslims.
this, you're told a snowflake, you're told a libtard, you're told to harden up. It's only a joke. You guys can't take a bit of criticism, right? I think Anu Kaloti invented a new word in the English language. And they call us woke. What's the right-wing version of woke? I tell you, it's roke. And these
Roke.
people are
Roke.
woke. Yeah, they're snowflakes. Winston, you can't take criticism. You dish it out, mate, but you can't take it, right? You'll take a high court judge to court because she doesn't agree with you, yeah? I dare you, please take me to court so I can put you on trial for what free speech is and how you are not above criticism. And I will teach you the English language and the power of metaphor, right? That you are for the chop, you are for the sack, your head should roll. None of this literally means anybody wants to kill you, boomer. Yeah, it means that you should learn when to go. So
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also
Yes.
like, like you said, Joe, guillotine has, it seems to me from my how I've observed New Zealand politics over the last 12 years that I've been here, is, New New Zealand First and Winston Peters tries to epitomize kind of the Western Enlightenment tradition and kind of, as kind of the Western supremacist kind of worldview, where even, for example, one of the campaign policies that did he they did manage to get was making English official language of New Zealand, which is just like, what a waste of time. Like, what language are we speaking in this country? Why couldn't we use those precious hours where, this is taxpayer money going into the parliament time, into solving issues like homelessness? We have literally homeless people, freezing on the streets in this country, across this country, and we are wasting parliament time talking about a completely non-issue like making New Zealand official language when that's the language that we're speaking in right throughout this country all the time. And also, you touched upon individual versus structural power, where, it seems as though Winston Peters has no understanding of this, right? So he is sitting in an official position as a minister in the cabinet of New Zealand, and he's punching down upon individuals, right, in the community, whether it is you guys, whether it is that student from the university whose photographs he posted right through his social media, inviting people to bully him and attack him. And so that's another thing I wanted to ask you, Anu. I think you wanted to say something, but what was the aftermath of these singling out of Winston Peters, of your protest, and the visuals of your protest? Yeah.
So, Winston, I think he's totally lost it. He's being interviewed by media after, I think, the next day or a couple of days after, and the journalist is asking him, so what are your views on this protest? And he's like, oh yeah, the people who've done this, they should be charged. And it's totally unacceptable in this democracy and what have you. And then the journalist next asks him, have you made a complaint to the police? And Winston answers, oh, plenty of people have told me, and you've just told me, maybe you can go and complain to the police. I mean, what kind of illogical answer is that? Winston has a problem with this protest, and yet he is asking the media to complain to the police and take the matter to the police. That just does not add up at any level at all. So while that's where Winston has kind of stopped, maybe he is too old to do what he did with that young teenage protester you just mentioned. Maybe it's just he doesn't have the energy or doesn't have the competence anymore. But I think we do have more right-wing media outlets, platforms, or whatever you want to call them, because there's a lot of podcasters and YouTubers who have done that job instead of what Winston would have done a few years ago. So I've been interviewed by like News Talk ZB, the platform, and all that, and their viewership or listenership is like just the typical racist vote bank that New Zealand First goes for. So there have been attacks, personal attacks, like by the way of we should find out where they live and go protest outside their place, or just phone them and this is what they do for their livelihood and maybe you should report them there, and just general really derogatory comments about a person's immediate identity, which actually serves purpose at all. While it may hurt the feelings for a few seconds, but then I think we as activists have trained ourselves to somewhat rise above that and focus on the issue, right? Okay, this is just momentarily, it's not going to last forever, it'll pass. Just remain focused, and this is what we've done, this is what we do next. So and then we had another theatrical protest just this weekend gone, which was, we had more support, we had more solidarity, and also I would like to take this opportunity to thank every person, every organization who has reached out in support and offered their solidarity and practical support. So there's more support out there than hate. That's what I would like to say.
That's great.
And people who attack without any philosophy or principles or ethics behind that attack are always just like empty attacks and empty threats, and they don't carry those empty threats out. I've not seen it yet. So and also after the last Saturday's protest, there's like all these people are now very, very quiet. There's no kind of
Yeah, so sounds like it is Winston Peters that's the snowflake here and the sensitive one. Seems like
Hmm.
both of you are weathering, the attacks basically unleashed by his singling out of, people, members of the community, common citizens who are protesting. It seems like you guys are taking it, on the stride and aware that this is part of being an activist, whereas he doesn't know that being a politician warrants public criticism and protest, and he doesn't seem to know what the job entails. Um,
I mean, this is what happens to the ruling class when they go out of touch with the people, right? You know, in another timeline, this racist playbook would have worked for Winston. It's what's worked for him every other election before. And I would argue that reformist politicians facilitate this with their weak need response and their unwillingness to rule out this racist from a possible coalition later. So they allow him to get away with this because he could be the kingmaker that they're going to rely on, right? We were out to destroy this time. And as well as being a socialist, I'm a situationalist. I'm a punk rocker. I got into politics through punk. Punk deals with symbolic outrage without hurting any human being at all, but it smashes the bourgeois myths, whether it's monarchy, whether it's the respectability of an old drunk alcoholic racist. And off with their heads, God save the Queen and the fascist regime. You might not like that message if you're upper middle class or a racist, but it certainly gets across and it's certainly remembered. And in this case, it has re-established the cordon sanitaire, the agreement after 1945 by both wings of the bourgeois order, either left with Labour parties or right with national or conservative parties, that there would be no coalitions after World War II with any far right or neo-Nazi parties because they were beyond the border, if you like, the border of sanitation, the cordon sanitaire. This is a phrase that comes from medical things, actually from pandemics, actually, where we needed to have a border, a cordon that kept society clean from a disease that could spread. How ironic. A pandemic comes back to you again, Winston. But this is what's just happened. Both major parties have now ruled out a coalition with this man and his party because of his racism. In the case of Luxon, he faces his own head on a stick, possibly tomorrow, because of his weak need dealing with this, right?
yeah, so this has led to some, it's been moving and shaking up things a little bit, hasn't it? So I feel like the protest has had a massive impact. Just
Mm.
yesterday, I saw a stuff poll which said that, majority of people who participated in that stuff poll wanted um, Winston Peters sacked for his racist tirade in Parliament. So it seems like public are on your side. It seems like, it's actually shaking things up in the National Party. So there is this update that's happening. Anu, would either of you like to talk about what's going on in National today?
Uh, it looks like the caucus does not have confidence in Christopher Luxon. So there is an urgent caucus meeting tomorrow morning. This is, yeah, tomorrow, whatever the date is, 12th of August, yeah, in the morning. And yeah, but I think the National have been there not so long ago. I think it was back in April, and Luxon managed to survive that time. But this time, yeah, I hope he doesn't survive because it's not good enough saying that at first it was okay, Winston made these comments just to get attention, and then a couple of days later it then progressed to those remarks were racist, but I will not be sacking him as the foreign minister. That is just unacceptable. How can you allow your foreign minister to be racist and xenophobic, and that too towards and disrespecting a country that is the biggest trading partner of New Zealand. While I personally don't measure, people are not economic objects, and I don't value people like that. So all the racism that has been directed at individuals and people is still wrong, even if China wasn't our biggest trading partner. But yeah, just looking at the practicalities of the whole situation. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the outcome will be tomorrow. And it's also being reported that there seems to be some sort of tension or infighting within the MPs, like the more senior MPs within National Party. So that maybe there's a bit of a race on to replace Christopher Luxon. So it'll be good.
Yeah,
to see what happens
just briefly, before I go myself, I just need to go. But I think what's also happened is suddenly this election has become quite exciting. It was quite boring beforehand, because I think as well that the real issues are not being dealt with by politicians of the right in New Zealand. We're attacking disabled people, we're attacking migrants, we're attacking. I mean, the culture wars are being fought by the right, actually, punching down on people and actually diverting from the real issues that need to be dealt with in New Zealand, like the cost of living, like our terrible, expensive rent situation and housing crisis, and also the war, the genocide, the undermining of our independent foreign policy in New Zealand. 70% of people in New Zealand oppose the war in Iran. We want to see action on genocide. We want to see Israel condemned. We want to see the ambassador, expelled. We want to see our own citizens protected when they're abroad, especially people like Hahona Ormsby and others who are on the flotilla to Gaza, who were abducted by Israel and tortured. The foreign minister should have protected citizens abroad. That's his job. He should have been sacked for that alone, for not protecting or people there. No condemnation from this government or its foreign minister of the 168 schoolgirls that were killed in Iran. These are the people who say that they want to, give rights to women in Iran, and yet they didn't say nothing about those schoolgirls being killed. Why? Because Winston Peters openly associates with the pedophile class that are running the United States of America at the minute. Trump should not be given any respect or be mimicked by any Western politician, because that man is revoltingly evil. He's up to his neck in corruption. The Epstein files, everybody knows exactly, what these people are like. And so we're actually living in exciting times, comrades. And maybe what's going to happen in New Zealand, now that the ruling class are fighting amongst themselves in their own major party and with their batty, crazy coalition partners, where it's the crazy David Seymour, who also has a very shady past with the president of his party, who probably needs a guillotining as well. It's very, very exciting that now the right has collapsed, and rather than blame immigrants for the economic crisis, more and more people in the working class in New Zealand, whether we're brown, whether we're Maori, whether we're Tauiwi, whether we're LGBT, whether we're whatever, we're seeing that the real divide at the minute is between the people who are on struggle street, who are trying to work hard, who are facing mass unemployment, the worst in New Zealand's history in 12 years, even small business people being insulted by these corporate class of, 1,800 businesses alone this year going to the wall as the corporates just siphon money out of this country. I think we are going to see a victory of the left. And I think that in due is in no small part to the women workers who've taken to the streets in huge numbers to fight for pay equity, to the amazing hikoi we had to defend tirade with tens of thousands of people marching in the largest hikoi we saw across the Motu, surrounding the beehive and its politicians with the biggest hikoi in history. And we've also seen the biggest mobilizations of international solidarity in New Zealand's history, even bigger than the ones we had for South Africa, for Palestine, and against the wars that are now spreading to Lebanon, now spreading to Iran, Syria, the whole in beginnings of a world war, right? This is the energy. Hopefully New Zealand can buck the trend and put these far-right racists where they deserve, into the dustbin of history, and provide hope for the people in America, for the people in India, for the people in Australia who have the chance to give these people the chop in the election booth quite soon.
Thank you, Joe. If you want, you're heading out at the moment. Yeah, I really appreciate your contribution. Me and Anu will be continuing the conversation. I just also wanted to raise what Joe there raised is certain foundational questions about Western democracy model itself. For example, you can see that at a time where more and more working class people in this country are struggling to make ends meet, where, our health system is completely struggling with huge wait lists, waiting times in emergency rooms, leading to people dying, literally dying in the emergency rooms. Recently, there was a woman in her 40s who became homeless over the last few years, and she passed away. She was found with hypothermia on a beach. Literally people freezing to death on the streets of the so-called first world country. And meanwhile, we have a government that is spending $12 billion. They're making the defense budget $12 billion. And so they have money for wars, but they can't take care of their own people, right? So there's a question about democracy, right? Winston Peters was talking about democracy in Parliament. If you look at China's building roads, railways, hospitals, schools. And if there was a political party with that platform saying, we're going to build railways, public transport, renewable energy, and excellent jobs for people, lifting people out of poverty, that party probably would win. So,
definitely.
So it's like this question of democracy should be asked about, what impact do people, it's not just about voting once in 3 years. It's about what impact do people's voices and people's needs and people's democratic rights have on the policy making of a nation. And when it comes to New Zealand, it doesn't seem to be a huge impact, because time and again we see, whether it's Labour or National, they continuously break their promises to the working class, but they go above and beyond to support the wealthy, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is we can ask questions about Western liberal democracy as a whole. And, the Iran war is an excellent example. Who is this war for? Is the United States benefiting? Is the people in the United States, are they benefiting from it? No. The working class young people are fighting and dying, right? There's really young, just recently a young Hispanic woman who was part of the U.S. Army died. It's killing people. Over 4,000 people died in Iran. For what? Obviously, it's to access geopolitical control over the region and also control over the resources over there, right? So the military-industrial complex and the lobbies that control it, like the oil lobby, want their hands on Iran's oil. So really, in the West, the foreign policy is not really democratic. It's determined by the interests of these lobbies and these big industries that are literally the enemy of people and the planet.
Exactly. I mean, I agree 100% with everything that you've said there. I think under the guise of democracy, what we have is mostly the interests of the large corporates are being served, and then the military industrial complex, they are the ones who benefit from these wars. And you can even here in New Zealand talk to young people. I think it was yesterday morning on breakfast show on TV1. They were or a couple of days ago. They were interviewing people from, I think, Auckland University and some from Victoria University in Wellington, and they were like, we don't really have a future. And they were saying we are thinking of going to another country because we have nothing here. And you talk to young people who have already finished university and they may not have a job, or they may have some real basic job that they could have had that job without putting themselves through university and incurring a huge debt in a student loan. And they're like, they want to set up their prosperous lives. They want to be in a partnership with a spouse. They want to have children and start families, but they're like, we don't think we can because the money isn't going far enough. So it's a generation that is really hopeless, because that's the whole infrastructure around them does not give them any hope. It's almost dystopian, like in some of those movies we see, like Mad Max type movies. That's what it reminds me of, sadly. And I think we could have this discussion for a very, very long time. It is ironic that you mentioned that Winston started his political career that coincided with the downturn of, the workers' rights were getting diluted,
Yes.
and the unions were being taken out, and they did not have as much power. And then and then come the 90s, the whole neoliberal agenda. And I mean, we've seen that in both our home countries, in India with Manmohan
Yes.
Singh, that
Yeah.
that was his entire project, to absolutely implement the neoliberal agenda, and yet he is seen as like the best prime minister ever, because he had the from the finance sector. He'd worked, where was it, the World Bank or IMF, I forget, but he'd come from one of those
Mm.
big um,
Yes.
yeah. Yeah, so this is, and also, I guess, because the Soviet Union fell, and that kind of gave all these so-called democracies a free pass to do whatever they wanted to do,
Yes.
while and also even going further back, I'm thinking now 1917, the Russian Revolution. Soon after, a lot of the European countries, like Western European countries, brought in social welfare.
Yeah.
That wasn't because they felt sorry for their citizens, and they really wanted to do good for them. That was to stop those people uprising and
Avoid a revolution.
avoiding revolutions, because those people could see what happened in 1917 in
Yeah.
Russia. And
Yeah.
they were motivated, organized, and mobilized to do the same. So, it was, the fall of Soviet Union also had a big part to
Oh,
play in
absolutely.
where we are today. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love that you brought it to that. So we're seeing this kind of conflict between, two different political and economic systems.
Mhm.
And, the moment you get the Russian Revolution, but also the anti-colonial struggles in the global South, where it was
Yeah.
this, the people that Western workers were taught to look down upon, they were threatening empire, right? And
Yeah.
so it was becoming clear that people can organize and overthrow the biggest empire
Mm.
in the world.
Yeah.
And so all of that, you know, flew kind of came in to that moment of social democratic shift in the West, which led to
Mhm.
universal pensions, huge public housing
Yeah. Yeah.
schemes, but also, rapid construction of public infrastructure in the public sector, right?
Yeah.
So New
Yeah.
Zealand
Yeah.
was New Zealand had a public works department, and so it was
Yes.
solving multiple issues at the same time. It was probably solving the housing issue, which was really bad at the time. The working class settlers were in really horrible squalor, and so like Michael Joseph Savage came in and
Yes.
said,
Yep.
"We're going to address both the housing issue and the unemployment issue
Yes.
by creating a public works department
Yeah. Yeah.
and building houses." So,
Yeah.
this is the kind of, what do you say, approach that
Yeah.
Winston Peters claims to be from, right? The Muldoonian and the social democratic phase of the National Party. That's what he originally, that's what he wanted to create his DNA as. But when we see him, through the years, we can see that his legacy is being a tool of the neoliberal system. And all this devastation we're seeing in that the working class in this country has faced over the last 50 years, he has been in positions of very, significant power. And so he has overseen that. So ultimately, when you look at his legacy, we can say that it is a failure in bringing any substantial change in reversing this neoliberal direction of New Zealand. And so New Zealand has become an anti-worker state, hugely unequal. But also, when you think about it, right, the effect of the Soviet Union was, the Western ruling class was thinking, unless we'd make some concessions, the socialists are gonna, basically take over the world. So the ruling class did make a compromise with the Western working class movements. Obviously, it was the more moderate elements of it that came to power. So the Labour Party in 1935 actually represented the moderate wing of the workers' movement, because there was a Communist Party in New Zealand. There was a more left-wing radical element to the working class movement, which was ready for revolution, but one that clinched political power. Within this liberal democratic system, you can't really get political power unless we have some acceptability to the bourgeoisie, because they do control the media and narrative and so forth. So they can destroy and truly, a challenger. But the moderate element comes into power, and they allow, effectively, it gives a lease of life to global capitalism, really, the social democratic phase.
Really. Yes.
So
absolutely. But I guess the state this country is in now, when we compare it to the liberal Democrat Labour Party in the 1930s, I mean, they look very radical and revolutionary compared to what we have now. But
absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally. Like, very clearly so. So talking about, compulsory unionship, about public sector expansion, about, workers' rights to education and healthcare. So it was indeed a very radical time. And it's owing to the global workers' movement and the global, proletarian movement also happening in the global South against imperialism. So I think this is really where we need to locate our movements. We can't isolate our movements into narrow, boundaries of nation state. We need to contextualize the issues that we are facing at a global scale. And again, that is a failure, I feel, of Winston Peters. Sometimes I feel like calling him Winston Churchill, because
well, there's hardly, not much difference there, I guess.
Yeah. I would say that they probably align ideologically, right?
Yes.
If you want to use a term like, Winston Peters is, tangata whenua, but he kind of internalizes the colonial, epistemic kind of system, the knowledge system, as well as the economic system and the traditions of the British Empire, the way he dresses, the way he speaks. He has this nostalgia. I would argue that he's just a bit emotional. He's too emotional. He's too emotional to actually see through what's going to happen in the 21st century, because the 21st century is going to witness the decay and the disintegration of the Western Empire. The US Empire is really unraveling before our eyes.
Yes, yes.
They're being humiliated in Iran.
Yes.
They're being humiliated by China on, on this peaceful tech kind of race that we're seeing.
Yeah.
China is far exceeding or superseding the United States and the West on so many fronts.
Yeah.
So it's not, the future is not going to be, the traditional old Western empire. The future is elsewhere. The future is in Asia. The future is in Africa. China can see it. China's building ties with Africa primarily, more so than. So, I mean, if only Winston Peters had that level of, logical, rational analysis of the world rather than an emotional attachment to the past, the empires of the past.
I on that note, I would say I think maybe most other politicians in this country don't have that kind of analysis or vision either.
That's right.
With a few exceptions, perhaps. I mean, why is it when Greens say that tax the rich, why does everyone get nervous? I mean, that in itself is I would again say that that's not very radical in itself, but people, other politicians or ministers and everybody else around gets nervous just by the mention of that we should tax the rich, or the corporates should pay tax properly. They should stop tax evasion. Even that would go a long way.
Yeah.
I think most politicians are not competent, capable of actually grasping what it is that needs to be done to lift people out of poverty, to give people dignity and a decent life. And I think most of
those
them
are the fundamental questions, isn't it? How can we have a society where, our values are upheld, our values of, just living in a society where everyone's dignity is upheld, right? That should be the baseline of any society. But I think ultimately it's a question of, the kind of political and economic system we have, because under capitalism, there is no incentive to solve homelessness. There is no incentive to solve poverty, because homelessness, what it does is it has a disciplining effect on the working class, right? So as long as there's a certain percentage of people who are homeless and unemployed, it is a warning to the people who have employment and who are living inside a home that unless you are a disciplined worker for this horrific system, this is your, this is where you'll be. So really, there's no incentive. In fact, in economics, in capitalist economics, which in my view is kind of like a cult, there is this notion of what is a healthy level of unemployment. So really, there's a percentage of unemployment that is required within the system in order to discipline, the working class. But so that's the thing, right? There is no incentive to solve these problems. So we need to ask some fundamental questions about the way we have organized society and whether this is indeed democratic, because it doesn't seem so.
No, it doesn't. And under capitalism, it all comes back to that personal responsibility that, if you get enough education, if you get enough skills, then you can or you will get a good job. But if you don't, you'll be on the bottom of the pile. You'll never move up the whatever ladder it is. So it's down to me as an individual to make sure that I succeed and to make sure that I earn enough. It's a very, very, I could say many, many words about it, but to say the least, it's a very cruel system. And it's not a pro-people system for sure. It only serves the few, the people at the top who make profit out of my labor, your labor, and everybody else's labor. Extremely cruel system. And I'm being very polite. I could think of many harsh words, but I'll remain polite.
Oh, yes. I mean, the system is
Yeah.
so perverse that
Mm.
we have a situation where, even in New Zealand, there was one study from 2018 that's found that there's like about 60,000 tons of food wasted by supermarkets every year, whereas at the same time we have, 1 in 7 children living in material hardship. So there is an incentive to actually
Yeah.
throw food away rather than give it because of the
Hmm.
profit
Yes.
motive, right? There
Yeah.
were situations where farmers, poured out milk when the
Yeah.
prices went
Yes.
down. So
Yes.
it's just a very perverse system, which is not
Mm-hmm.
really a logical or scientific, because
Hmm.
Western um, civilization advocates
Yeah.
talk
Yeah.
about rationality and science and all that. But
Mm-hmm.
really, capitalism is a very irrational and unscientific method of dealing with the problems of society because it incentivizes, for example, profiting from disease, which is a
Mm.
major
Yeah.
thing in the
Yes.
United States, right? Oh,
Yeah.
and many countries across the world where you get
Hmm.
sick and then you go into debt. And it's
Yeah.
becoming the case over here. Recently, I was asked to get some kind of a scan, and then, going in public is not even because the wait list is so,
Yes.
um, and when I went to the private, sector, they said it's more than $600 just for a
Yeah.
scan. So just
Mm-hmm.
putting people into so much financial stress,
Mm-hmm.
and also like the incentive for constant this permanent war economy, for example. That's another example
Mm-hmm.
of the perversions of capitalism, how
Mm-hmm.
people can make billions of money out of just bombing children, for example.
Yes.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
the system is so perverse and it really needs an overthrow. It is not a democratic system.
No, no,
Western,
definitely not.
what the United States and its allies
Mhm.
represent is an antithesis of democracy.
Yeah.
It is the case that, economic power and political power go hand
Mhm.
in hand.
Yeah.
And unless we have economic democracy, we really can't claim to have political democracy.
Absolutely right. Yeah. Absolutely right.
So, shall we wind up there, Anu?
Yeah, I
Do you
think
have
that's
any?
a no, no, I think that's a good point to yeah,
Yeah,
conclude on.
can you
Yeah. Yeah.
talk about what the future plans are
Yeah.
in terms of protests and if you would like to,
Yeah.
inform the listeners about future actions?
Sure, sure. I think there will be a few more events by the way of protests leading up to a general election on 7th of November. Uh, and one of the dates for people to mark in their calendars is 17th of October. That's a Saturday. So we plan to hold hopefully quite a big, um, like a march, I guess, a march of migrants to, yeah, keep voicing against this racism and xenophobia, and also to put on the agenda what people's immigration policy actually looks like. So we did have a very kind of brief event few weeks ago where we presented what we call people's immigration policy by the people, of the people, for the people. We presented it to some MPs from Labour Party and Green Party for them to take it forward leading up to the election. So we'll probably just build on that. And then, yeah, also, like I said, against racism and xenophobia, especially coming from people sitting in powerful positions, and that just filters down and normalizes it for ordinary people, which has to stop. So yeah,
Hmm.
watch this space, I guess. 17th of October is definite, but there will be other events before that.
Yeah, and I want to commend you, Anu, and your comrades for shaking things up a little bit. This is the objective of the protest movements is to actually create change in society and
Mhm.
raising attention to issues that really need urgent, attention. And when we are slipping into the sort of like a fascistic future, then it is voices like yours that are so important as a guiding light and as a pivot for change. So I thank you and I commend you both and your comrades, everyone involved in the protest movements for the rights of migrants against the genocide, for rights of workers here, for affordable living conditions here. And, we will take the movement forward.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
This was a special episode of 1 of 200. See you next time.